This is lecture 36B on the Empire Strikes Back Against South America, this time part 2. You'll recall yesterday when we stopped on this that we were talking about Orlando Letelier, the assassination of him and his secretary Ronnie Moffett, and riding in the same car that the CIA blew up was her husband. Those two died in the hospital, but her husband had survived. Okay, so we had gotten that far into it. Now, we know that the CIA had targeted Letelier as soon as he came back into the United States as a private citizen, and they decided to use DINA as the assassination operator, that is the Chilean Secret Service, because they were quite willing to do it. They considered him to be one of their primary enemies. He had been the ambassador of Salvador Allende. When he was president of Chile, he'd been their ambassador to Washington after the Pinochet coup, where they killed everybody in sight that had been working with Allende, under the CIA's direction, of course, working with them and all of that. Now they wanted to get this guy if they possibly could, which is why the CIA was quite willing to help them kill him in Washington, D.C., which is where this assassination happened. Now, eventually Michael Townley, General Manuel Contreras, the former head of DINA, the Brigadier General Pedro Espinosa Bravo, also formerly of DINA, were convicted of these murders. In 1978, Chile agreed to transfer Townley to the U.S. in order to reduce the tensions about Letelier's murder. Now, Townley was freed and taken into the U.S. Witness Protection Program. The U.S. is still awaiting extradition of Manuel Contreras and Pedro Espinosa on murder charges. Of course, they'll never get that. In December 2004, Francisco Letelier, the son of Orlando Letelier, wrote in an op-ed column in the LA Times that his father's assassination was part of Operation Condor, and in that op-ed he described Condor as an intelligence-sharing network used by 6 South American dictators of that era to eliminate dissidents, quote unquote. Michael Townley accused Pinochet of being responsible for Letelier's death. Townley confessed to hiring 5 anti-Castro Cuban exiles to booby-trap Letelier's car. Same sort of thing they did on the Watergate break-in. According to Jean-Guy Allard, the assassination plan was planned by the terrorist organization CORU and its leadership, specifically Luis Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch. These two selected Cuban Americans Jose Dionisio Suarez, Virgilio Paz Romero, Alvin Ross Diaz, and brothers Guillermo and Ignacio Novo Sampol to carry out the murders. According to the Miami Herald, not only was Luis Posada Carriles at this meeting, but it was at this time they decided not just on Letelier's death, but also they planned the Cubana Flight 455 bombing. Now, which killed everybody on board, of course, as it flew from Caracas, which was mostly a sports team, to Havana. Luis Posada Carriles now lives under permanent U.S. protection from prosecution in Miami. CIA's Plan B against Chile, Operation Silence. Operación Silencio was a conspiracy to impede investigations by Chilean judges. The conspiracy centered on removal of witnesses from the country. It started about a year before the terror archives were found in Paraguay. Now, in April 1991, Arturo Sanhueza Ross was proven as the murderer of MIR leader Hector Negme in 1989, and he left the country. The Rettig report reported Hector Negme's murder was done by Chilean intelligence agents, and in September 1991, Carlos Herrera Jimenez, proven as the murderer of trade unionist Tucapel Jimenez, left by plane. In October 1991, Eugenio Berrios, a chemist who had worked with DINA agent Michael Townley, a CIA agent, was escorted from Chile to Uruguay by Operation Condor agents. In this way, they prevented him from testifying in the Letelier case. The fact that this escape utilized Argentinian, Uruguayan, Paraguayan, and Brazilian passports meant the CIA's Operation Condor was not dead. It was in Plan B mode. In January 2005, Michael Townley, who now lives in the U.S. under the Witness Protection Program, acknowledged links between Chile, DINA, and the detention and torture center Colonia Dignidad. The center was established in 1961 by Paul Schaefer, who was arrested in March 2005 in Buenos Aires and convicted on charges of child rape. Townley informed Interpol about Colonia Dignidad and the Army's bacteriological warfare laboratory. This last laboratory replaced the old DINA laboratory on Villa Naranja de la Curo Street, where Townley worked with the chemical assassin Eugenio Berrios. Berrios was found dead in El Pinar near Montevideo in 1995, his body mutilated so as to make identification impossible. The toxin that killed Christian Democrat Eduardo Frei Montalva was made in this lab in Colonia Dignidad, according to the judge investigating the case. In 2013, a Brazilian, Uruguayan, Argentinian collaborative documentary, Dossier Django, Django Dossier, that's his reference to the former president João Goulart, implicated the same lab in the poisoning of João Goulart, Brazil's deposed president. Plan B, concealment of plot against U.S. Congressman Edward Koch. Now, that's spelled K-O-C-H, but it's pronounced differently depending on who you are. In Koch's case, he pronounced it the way I'm doing it right now, because that's the way he pronounced it, so that it rhymes with Scotch, for example. But generally speaking, K-O-C-H in American versions of English is pronounced Coke, the way the Koch brothers pronounce it. But at any rate, in this particular case, it's K-O-C-H, Koch. Now, in February 2004, reporter John Dingus published The Condor Years, How Pinochet and His Allies Brought Terrorism to 3 Continents. He revealed that Uruguayan military officials threatened to assassinate U.S. Congressman Edward Koch, later mayor of New York City, in mid-1976. Now, the interesting part starts now, because in late July 1976, the CIA station chief in Montevideo had the details. And however, he recommended that the agency, the CIA, take no action to thwart the plan. The Uruguayan officers included Colonel Jose Fans, who was at the November 1975 secret meeting in Santiago, Chile. In addition, Major Jose Nino Gavasso was a co-conspirator. Fons had been chief of a team of intelligence thugs working in Argentina in 1976 and has been proven to have killed at least 100 Uruguayans. Now, George H.W. Bush threatens Koch. Recently interviewed by Dingus, Koch said that George H.W. Bush, then CIA director, informed him in October 1976 that he was a target, that is, that Koch was a target for assassination. This was more than 2 months after Orlando Letelier's murder in Washington. Bush said, quote, "My sponsorship," meaning Koch's sponsorship, "of legislation to cut off U.S. military assistance to Uruguay on human rights grounds had provoked secret police officials to put a contract out for you," unquote. Now, in mid-October 1976, Koch then wrote to the Justice Department asking for FBI protection, but none was provided. Later in 1976, in fact, Colonel Fons and Major Gavasso were assigned to prominent Uruguayan diplomatic posts in Washington, D.C. The State Department forced the Uruguayan government to withdraw their appointments with the public explanation that Fons and Gavasso could be the objects of unpleasant publicity. Koch only learned about the connections between the threats and the post appointments in 2001. Paraguay. Now, the USA helped the fascist president of Paraguay, General Alfredo Stroessner, in many ways. One Pentagon agent facilitating this aid to the Paraguayan dictatorship was U.S. Army officer Lieutenant Colonel Robert Thierry. Thierry was sent to instruct local workmen in Asunción, the capital of Paraguay, in how to build what became the well-known interrogation by torture center named La Técnica as part of Operation Condor. And in the book, when you get it, you're going to see a few of the excerpts from the testimony that was provided to prove all of this. But I'm going to move on. We have a lot of ground to cover. There are many other famous disappearances. The disappearances is a euphemism for murder. in secret. In 1977, Edgardo Enriquez, Chilean leader of the MIR, disappeared in Argentina, as did MIR leader Jorge Fuentes. Alexei Hacard and Ricardo Ramirez were disappeared, and a support network to the Communist Party was picked up and murdered in Argentina. Attacks in Argentina against German, Spanish, Peruvian, and Jewish people were widespread. The assassinations of former Bolivian President Juan José Torres and former Uruguayan deputies Hector Gutierrez and Zelmar Michelini in Buenos Aires in 1976 were also part of Condor. The DINA contacted Ustaše Croatian terrorists, Italian neo-fascists, and the Shah of Iran's Savak, S-A-V-A-K, killers to locate and assassinate dissidents in Argentinian exile. In other words, they preferred to operate through these third parties, the CIA. According to reports in 2006, resulting from trials to top officials in Argentina, Operation Condor was at its peak in 1976 when Chilean exiles in Argentina were threatened. Many went underground or into exile again in other countries. Chilean General Carlos Prats had been assassinated by DINA in Buenos Aires in 1974 with the help of CIA agent Michael Townley. Cuban diplomats were assassinated in Buenos Aires in the Automotores Orlete Torture Center, one of 300 clandestine prisons of the Argentine fascist junta dictatorship. These centers were managed by the Grupo de Tareas 18, headed by former military officer and intelligence agent Aníbal Gordon, earlier convicted of armed robbery, who reported directly to General Comandante of the SIDE, Otto Palladino. Automotores Orlete was the main base of foreign intelligence services involved in Operation Condor, including the main base for the U.S. CIA. José Luis Bertasso, a survivor of kidnapping and torture who was detained there for 2 months, identified Chilean, Uruguayan, Paraguayan, and Bolivian nationals held as prisoners and who were interrogated by agents from their own countries. The 19-year-old daughter-in-law of poet Juan Gelman was tortured here along with her husband before being transported to a Montevideo prison. There she delivered a baby which was immediately stolen by Uruguayan military officers and placed for illegal adoption with friends of the regime. Decades later, President Jorge Batlle ordered an investigation, and finally Macarena Gelman was found and recovered her identity. According to Dinger's book, Los Años del Condor, The Years of the Condor, Chilean MIR prisoners in the Orlete Center told José Luis Bertasso that they had seen 2 Cuban diplomats, 22-year-old Jesus Cejas Arias and 26-year-old Crescencio Galanega, tortured by Gordon's group. A man who had traveled from Miami to interrogated them. The Cuban nationals had been responsible for protection of the Cuban ambassador to Argentina, Emilio Aragones. They were kidnapped on 9 August 1976 at the corner of Calle Arribeños and Virrey del Pino by 40 armed SIDE, S-I-D-E, agents who blocked the street with their Ford Falcons, which were the car models preferred by the security forces during the dictatorship. According to Dinges, the FBI and the CIA were informed of their arrest. He quotes a cable sent from Buenos Aires by FBI agent Robert Scherer on 22 September 1976, in which he mentioned that Michael Townley, later convicted for the assassination of former Chilean Minister Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C., had taken part in the interrogation of the 2 Cubans. And he, of course, as you know, lives under permanent witness protection in the U.S. On 22 December 1999, the former head of the DINA confirmed to Argentina federal judge Maria Servini de Cubria in Santiago de Chile that Michael Townley and Cuban Guillermo Novo Sampol were present in the Orlete Center. They had traveled from Chile to Argentina on 11 August 1976 and cooperated in the torture and assassination of the 2 Cuban diplomats, quote unquote. Luis Posada Carriles, an anti-Castro Cuban terrorist, boasted in his autobiography, The Roads of the Warrior, Los Caminos del Guerrero, the murder of the two young men. As we have seen, Luis Posada Carriles now lives under permanent U.S. protection in Miami. Inside Condor. The United States provided direct organizational, financial, and technical assistance to Operation Condor through the 1980s. The U.S. government directed DINA operations via the CIA and other intelligence agencies as the brains of Condor. CIA documents prove its direction of the Chilean secret police DINA and its chief Manuel Contreras. In fact, Contreras was retained as a paid CIA agent until 1977, until his involvement in the Letelier Moffat assassination was proven. The Paraguayan archives include official requests to the CIA and FBI to track suspects. The CIA provided lists of suspects and other intelligence information to the fascist junta governments. In 1975, the FBI searched in the U.S. for individuals wanted by DINA. On 5 October 1976, Henry Kissinger met with Argentina's foreign minister and said, quote, "Look, our basic attitude is that we would like you to succeed. I have an old-fashioned view that friends ought to be supported. What is not understood in the United States is that you have a civil war. We read about human rights problems, but not the context. The quicker you succeed, the better. The human rights problem is a growing one. Your ambassador can apprise you. We want a stable situation. We will not cause you unnecessary difficulties, but if you can finish before Congress gets back, that would be better. Whatever freedoms you could restore along the way would help." Henry Kissinger, U.S. Secretary of State, in the 5 October 76 record of conversation. Enter Harry Schlademan. Harry Schlademan was the CIA agent acting as a career CIA agent inside the U.S. State Department and ambassador to Lima, Peru, when I was captured in Lima. And he was the head of the embassy there the entire time I was in prison. In June 1999, by order of President Bill Clinton, the State Department released thousands of declassified documents revealing for the first time that the CIA and the State and Defense Departments were intimately aware of Condor. One DoD, Department of Defense intelligence report dated 1 October 1976, noted that Latin American military officers bragged about it to their U.S. counterparts. The same report described Condor's joint counterinsurgency operations that aimed to eliminate Marxist terrorist activities, quote unquote. Argentina, it noted, created a special Condor team, quote, structured much like a U.S. Special Forces team, unquote. A summary of material declassified in 2004 states. The declassified record shows that Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was briefed on Condor and its murder operations on August 5, 1976, in a 14-page report from Harry Schlademan, then Assistant Secretary of State. Internationally, the Latin generals look like our guys, Schlademan continued. We are especially identified with Chile, and this cannot do us any good. And as I say, from this job, he was sent to Lima to be the U.S. ambassador there. Schlademan and his two deputies, William Lewers and Hewson Ryan, recommended cover-up action. Over the course of 3 weeks, they drafted a cautiously worded demarque approved by Kissinger in which he instructed the U.S. ambassadors in the Southern Cone countries to meet with the respective heads of state about Condor. Schlademan instructed them to express official concern over rumors in the press about torture, kidnapping, and murder to make a record of plausible deniability. Ultimately, the demarque was never delivered. Now, Kornblue and Dinges suggest that the decision not to send Kissinger's order was due to Assistant Secretary Harry Schlademan's sending a cable to his deputy in D.C., which states, quote, "You can simply instruct the ambassadors to take no further action," noting that there have been no reports in some weeks indicating an intention to activate the Condor scheme, unquote. Schlademan was on his way to Peru, where he oversaw my arrest in 1977. J. Patrice McSherry has written, a quote, "According to U.S. Ambassador to Paraguay Robert White, instructions from Secretary of State via his assistant Schlademan cannot be ignored unless there is a countermanding order received via a secret CIA back channel. Kornbluth and Dingus concluded that the paper trail is clear. The State Department and the CIA had enough intelligence to take concrete steps to thwart Condor assassination planning. Those steps were initiated but never implemented. In fact, the CIA directed the entire operation. Just as a matter of interest, the current U.S. ambassador to Peru is another career CIA agent, as I have exposed a few times in the Peruvian press. Schlademann's deputy, Houston Ryan, later acknowledged in an oral history interview that the State Department was remiss in its handling of the case. Quote, "We knew fairly early on that the governments of the Southern Cone countries were planning, or at least talking about, some assassinations abroad in the summer of 1976. Whether, if we had gone in, we might have prevented this, I don't know," unquote, he stated in reference to the Atelier Mafia bombing. But we didn't. Of course they did not. They planned and directed the entire thing. A CIA document described Condor as, quote, "a counter-terrorism organization," unquote, and noted that the Condor countries had a specialized telecommunications system called Condor Tel. A 1978 cable from the U.S. Ambassador to Paraguay, Robert White, to Secretary of State Cyrus Vance was published on 6 March 2001 by the New York Times. The document was released in November 2000 by the Clinton administration under the Chile Declassification Project. White reported a conversation with General Alejandro Freitas Dávalos, Chief of Staff of Paraguay's Armed Forces, who informed him that the South American intelligence chiefs involved in Condor, quote, "kept in touch with one another through a U.S. communications installation in the Panama Canal Zone, which covered all of Latin America," unquote. Dávalos reportedly said that the installation was, quote, "employed to coordinate intelligence information among the Southern Cone countries," unquote. White feared that the U.S. connection to Condor might be publicly revealed at a time when the assassination in the USA of Chilean former Minister Orlando Letelier and his American assistant, Miss Ronnie Moffett, was being investigated. White cabled Vance that it would seem advisable to review this arrangement to ensure that its continuation is in U.S. interests. All of this is just cover talk to try and build some plausible deniability. J. Patrice McSherry describes such cables as, quote, "another piece of increasingly weighty evidence suggesting that U.S. military and intelligence officials supported and collaborated with Condor as a secret partner or sponsor." In addition, an Argentine military source told a U.S. Embassy contact that the CIA was privy to Condor and had played a key role in setting up computerized links among the intelligence and operation units of the 6 Condor states. Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State in the Nixon and Ford administrations, was closely involved diplomatically with the Southern Cone governments at the time and well aware of the Condor plan. According to the French newspaper L'Humanité, which is the daily newspaper of the French Communist Party, the first cooperation agreements were signed between the CIA and anti-Castro groups and the right-wing death squad AAA, set up in Argentina by Juan Perón and Isabel Martinez de Perón, and her personal secretary José López Rega and Rodolfo Alarón, who was arrested in Spain in 2006. On 31 May 2001, French Judge Robert Lalore requested that a summons be served on Henry Kissinger while he was staying at the Hotel Ritz in Paris. Lalore wanted to question the statesman as a witness regarding alleged U.S. involvement in Operation Condor and for possible U.S. knowledge concerning the disappearances of 5 French nationals in Chile during military rule. Kissinger left Paris that evening, quickly, and Laura's inquiries were directed then to the U.S. State Department. In July 2001, the Chilean High Court granted investigating Judge Juan Guzman the right to question Kissinger about the 1973 killing of American journalist Charles Horman. Horman's execution by the Chilean military after the coup was dramatized in the 1982 Costa Gavras film Missing. The judge's questions were related to Kissinger via diplomatic routes, but were never answered. In August 2001, Argentine Judge Rodolfo Canicova sent a letter rogatory to the U.S. State Department in accordance with the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, MLAT, requesting a deposition by Kissinger to aid the judge's investigation of Operation Condor. On 10 September 2001, a civil suit was filed in Washington, D.C. federal court by the family of General Rene Schneider, who had murdered the former commander-in-chief of the Chilean army, asserting that Kissinger ordered Schneider's murder because he refused to endorse plans for a military coup. Schneider was killed by coup plotters loyal to General Roberto Vial in a botched kidnapping attempt. As part of the suit, Schneider's two sons filed for civil damages against Kissinger and then CIA Director Richard Helms for $3 million. On 16 February 2007, a request for the extradition of Kissinger was filed at the Supreme Court of Uruguay on behalf of Bernardo Arnone, a political activist who was kidnapped, tortured, and disappeared by the fascist regime in 1976. Chilean Judge Juan Guzman, who had arraigned Pinochet at his return to Chile after his arrest in London, started prosecution of some 30 torturers, including former head of the DINA, Manuel Contreras, for the disappearance of 20 Chilean victims of the Condor plan. In Argentina, the CONIDEP Human Rights Commission of 1983, led by writer Ernesto Sabato, investigated human rights abuses during the Dirty War. The 1985 trial of the juntas convicted top officers who ran the military governments for acts of state terrorism. However, the amnesty laws, the law of Ley de Obediencia Debida and Ley de Punto Final of 1985-1986 ended the trials. The Congress repealed the laws in 2003, and in 2005 the Argentine Supreme Court ruled they were unconstitutional. Criminals such as Alfredo Astiz, sentenced in absentia in France for the kidnapping of the two French nuns Alice Dumont and Léonie Duquesne, and murder of Duquesne, whose remains were identified in 2005, can be prosecuted in Argentina now. Chilean Enrique Arancibia Clavel was convicted and sentenced in Argentina for the assassination of Carlos Prats and of his wife. Former Uruguayan President Juan María Bordaberry, his Minister of Foreign Affairs, and 6 military officers responsible for the disappearance in Argentina in 1976 of opponents to the Uruguayan regime were arrested in 2006. On 3 August 2007, General Raúl Iturriaga, former head of DINA, was captured in the Chilean town of Viña del Mar on the Pacific coast. He had previously been a fugitive from a 5-year jail term after being sentenced for the kidnapping of Luis Dagoberto San Martin, a 21-year-old opponent of Pinochet. Martin had been captured in 1974 and taken to a DINA detention center from which he disappeared. Iturriaga was also wanted in Argentina for the assassination of General Prats. According to the French Communist Party newspaper Le Humanité, quote, "In most of those countries, legal action against the authors of crimes against humanity from the 1970s to 1990s owes more to flaws in the amnesty laws than to a real will of the governments in power, which, on the contrary, waved the flag of national reconciliation. It is sad to say that 2 of the pillars of the Condor operation, Alfredo Stroessner, President of Peru, and Augusto Pinochet, President of Chile, never paid for their crimes and died without ever answering charges about the disappeared, who continued to haunt the memory of people who had been crushed by fascist brutality, like the mothers of the Plaza Mayo. Anyway, Chilean diplomat Orlando Lettier, killed in a car bomb in Washington, D.C. in 1976. Telesur reports on the October 8th issue 2015 that Augusto Pinochet has now been shown to have personally commanded the assassination of the Chilean diplomat who died in a car bomb, as we have already reviewed, and according to which the CIA has admitted in its declassified intelligence documents now. According to top-secret U.S. documents given to Chilean President Michel Bachelet on Tuesday in Santiago by the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, the general almost killed his own head of intelligence, General Manuel Contreras, to cover his tracks. Related, how the U.S. backed Pinochet's henchman Manuel Contreras. Well, at any rate, that's another story. Orlando Letelier had been loyal to ousted Chilean President Salvador Allende, as we've seen. He had eventually fled to the U.S. after being imprisoned and tortured during the 1973 coup, and there he was working for the Institute of Policy Studies. Letelier's son, Senator Juan Pablo Letelier, was shown the documents and discovered a memo from the then Secretary of State George Shultz to President Ronald Reagan revealing their knowledge of the attack. Quote, "There is a conclusive document from the CIA that shows Pinochet ordered the murder of my father. This is concrete information about how Pinochet covered up his responsibility," he told The Guardian. The Pinochet's predisposition to defend his position, he planned to eliminate Manuel Contreras to keep him from talking. Senator Letelier added an interview with the Mesa Central program on Tele 13 radio. The U.S. has long been acknowledged to have played a central role in Operation Condor, the right wing of wave of violence in Latin America that cracked down on dissenting voices. A further point of speculation is whether the CIA knew of the plan to kill Letelier, as other declassified documents indicate that what Manuel Contreras received a payment by the U.S. agency before the bombing and remained in contact with high-ranking officials there. Contreras was the military henchman who, more than any other, enforced the brutal repression that governed Chile during the dictatorship of Pinochet. As head of the DINA secret police, often referred to as Pinochet's Gestapo, Contreras was responsible for the torture and murder of hundreds of people. After Chile's 9/11, soccer stadiums were torture chambers. Today, most of his victims remain among Chile's thousands of disappeared, their families condemned to perpetual grief in absentia by the inhumanity of military rule. During Pinochet's military dictatorship from 1973 to 1990, more than 3,000 people were killed or disappeared and 38,000 tortured. The Chilean government recently created a new military unit designated to aid the investigation of abuses committed during the regime and break the decades-long pacts of silence. Chilean courts are currently investigating about 1,000 cases of kidnapping, killing, and torturing by Pinochet regime agents, but the process is slow and painstaking. And that concludes that particular chapter. Now, I'm just going to throw in a couple of comments here. I was arrested in Peru in 1977, and they held me in Peru until 1980. And under normal circumstances, the secret police there, acting under CIA DEA orders, would have killed me. And then they tried quite a few times, as I discuss in my books, which are volumes 4 and 5 of that Idaho Smith series. But the reason that they were unsuccessful was primarily because, as far as the Peruvians were concerned, they had arrested me on a drug trafficking warrant, and they, if you were a political person, they'd be happy to kill you. But if you were a drug trafficker, well, they wanted you to be their friend, because these are guys that are working their way up inside the secret police, and they, generally speaking, don't have distribution networks in the U.S., and they would like to have them. So it was a kind of a tricky tightrope to walk, but as long as they thought that I might be able to do them some good, well, they were quite willing to keep me informed of the various plots that the U.S. Embassy was hatching against me. And I describe all of that in books 4 and 5 of that Idaho Smith series for those of you who are interested, because it went on for almost 3 years. So it was a constant process. And, you know, in the course of doing that sort of thing, you learn a lot about how to protect yourself. And, well, I guess enough said about that particular topic. Now, we've finished this Operation Condor thing. Now, what I want to do next is, you'll recall that in the first set of lectures on Latin America, we went through the primitive communist period and up until a convenient break-off point of the 1940s, for example, and for most of these countries. So now we're going to go back to each of those countries, country by country, and take a look at specifically what happened in each of them.